There's something ancient cultures understood that modern society quietly forgot. Names are not just labels, they are identity anchors. And throughout history, many people believed a person's name could influence confidence, reputation, behavior, perception, emotional identity, and even financial destiny itself.
Now, before dismissing this as superstition, think carefully. Every single day, your name is repeated by other people, inside your own mind, in introductions, in memories, in conversations, in emotional experiences, thousands of times over a lifetime. Ancient thinkers believed repeated identity shapes behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. That's why names matter deeply. In many traditions, a name was never chosen casually. It was treated like psychological direction. Have you ever noticed something strange? Some people completely change after changing their name. Not magically, psychologically. They become more confident, more intentional, more expressive, more disciplined, more socially powerful. Why? Because identity changed emotionally. The way they saw themselves changed. The way others reacted changed. The energy attached to their self-image changed. That affects behavior more than most people realize. Human beings behave according to identity far more than motivation. A person who sees themselves as weak, unlucky, insignificant, incapable, usually behaves differently from someone who internally identifies as disciplined, valuable, intentional, respected. That affects communication, confidence, opportunities, emotional resilience, financial behavior, and names become attached to identity over time. That's why ancient people guarded names carefully. Modern psychology understands something fascinating. The brain reacts strongly to personal identity signals. That's why hearing your own name immediately grabs your attention. Your name is emotionally connected to memory, self-image, emotional experiences, social perception. Over time, that repeated emotional association becomes psychologically powerful. Ancient traditions sensed this long before modern science explained it. Some people spend years unconsciously carrying harmful identity labels, not always through their literal name, but through what they emotionally associate with themselves. For example, I'm always broke. I'm unlucky. People don't respect me. Success isn't for people like me. Repeated long enough, those labels become identity. And identity influences behavior automatically. That's dangerous financially too, because emotionally defeated people behave differently around opportunity. Throughout history, many traditions change a person's name after transformation. Why? Because identity had changed. A new name symbolized new direction, new responsibility, new mindset, new emotional reality. The old identity was considered finished. That's psychologically powerful, because humans respond strongly to symbolic identity shifts. Many people think wealth is only external, but internal self-image affects financial behavior deeply. Someone who feels unworthy, hopeless, insignificant may unconsciously sabotage opportunities, avoid visibility, fear success, settle for less, hesitate constantly. That creates financial limitation behaviorally. But someone with stronger self-perception behaves differently. That changes outcomes gradually. Think about it carefully. Certain names immediately create emotional impressions: strength, elegance, authority, confidence, warmth, trust. Why? Because the human mind attaches emotional meaning to identity signals automatically. That influences social interactions subconsciously, and social perception affects opportunities. Ancient people understood this intuitively. But here's the deeper truth. The most powerful name is not always the one people call you publicly. It's the identity you secretly call yourself internally. Because internal identity creates external behavior. A person constantly thinking, I am incapable, will move differently through life than someone repeating, I am becoming disciplined and intentional. That internal identity affects posture, confidence, communication, emotional control, decision-making, and eventually financial outcomes too. Your name becomes emotionally powerful because of repetition. Thousands of repetitions strengthen association, and repeated emotional association becomes conditioning. That's why repeated negative labels become dangerous, and repeated empowering identity becomes transformational. Ancient traditions understood repeated identity becomes lived reality, not magically, behaviorally. Many people today feel disconnected from identity entirely. Constant comparison online creates emotional confusion. People stop knowing who they are, what they value, what they stand for. That weakens confidence. And weak confidence affects financial behavior too, because uncertain people hesitate more, fear judgment more, avoid visibility more, tolerate less discomfort. That limits growth. Confidence changes social energy. People respond differently to emotionally grounded individuals, not because confidence guarantees success, but because behavior changes. Confident people often communicate more clearly, take more opportunities, remain calmer under pressure, recover faster from rejection. That creates different outcomes over time. Identity influences all of that, but the deeper reason names affected wealth had nothing to do with superstition. It had to do with the emotional programming attached to identity itself, because eventually, people become what they repeatedly believe they are. Most people think identity is something fixed, something permanent. But ancient thinkers believed identity was constantly reinforced through repetition. What a person hears repeatedly, feels repeatedly, and says repeatedly eventually shapes how they move through life. That's why names mattered so much historically, because a name was repeated constantly. And repeated identity becomes emotionally powerful over time. Human beings are deeply shaped by repeated patterns. That's how habits form, beliefs strengthen, emotional reactions develop, confidence grows, fear becomes normal. Repetition conditions the mind. Modern psychology understands this clearly. The subconscious absorbs repeated emotional messages gradually. That's why advertising works. That's why propaganda works. That's why negative self-talk works. And that's why identity reinforcement works too. Many people unknowingly spend years repeating destructive identity labels internally, not always aloud, silently. I'm not smart enough. I'm always struggling. I never succeed. I'm invisible. Nothing works for me. Repeated constantly, those thoughts stop feeling temporary. They begin feeling true. That changes behavior automatically, because people usually act according to who they believe they are. This may surprise many people. Some people unconsciously reject opportunities because success conflicts with their identity. If someone secretly believes, people like me don't become wealthy, then wealth can feel emotionally unnatural. That creates subconscious resistance. The person may procrastinate, self-sabotage, avoid visibility, fear responsibility, retreat during opportunity, not because they consciously want failure, but because identity influences behavior beneath awareness. Ancient traditions understood this deeply. In many cultures, a name represented more than identity. It represented direction, strength, character, purpose, responsibility. That's why names were often chosen carefully, because repeated identity signals shape emotional self-perception over time. And emotional self-perception affects life behaviorally. There's another layer many people ignore. People become influenced by how others repeatedly describe them too. A child constantly called lazy, foolish, weak, problematic may begin emotionally accepting those labels internally. Eventually, behavior starts matching the expectation. But the opposite is also true. Repeated positive reinforcement can strengthen confidence and capability. That's why language matters. Because repeated descriptions become internalized emotionally. People with low self-worth often struggle financially for hidden psychological reasons. Not always because of intelligence, but because self-perception affects boundaries, discipline, confidence, negotiation, opportunity tolerance. Someone who secretly feels unworthy may undercharge, settle too quickly, tolerate disrespect, fear asking for more, avoid ambitious goals. That limits growth. But stronger self-identity changes behavior naturally. Ancient people often describe names as carrying energy, not magical energy necessarily. Psychological energy, emotional atmosphere. Certain identities create emotional strength internally. Others create emotional heaviness. That affects posture, communication, confidence, emotional resilience, and people respond differently to different emotional states. That changes opportunities over time. Many people today have lost connection with identity completely. Constant comparison creates confusion. Social media trains people to become performers instead of grounded individuals. Eventually, people stop building real internal confidence. And without strong internal identity, external pressure controls behavior more easily. That creates emotional instability, inconsistency, fear of judgment, avoidance of risk, all of which affect financial behavior too. Emotionally grounded people often move differently through life. They speak differently, decide differently, tolerate pressure differently, recover from setbacks faster. That creates different outcomes over time. And identity shapes all of those behaviors because identity determines what feels natural to you. A person who identifies as disciplined behaves differently from someone identifying as hopeless. That difference compounds over years. This is where the real secret begins. Your legal name matters less than your internal identity voice, because the internal voice follows you constantly. If your internal identity says, "I'm powerless, I always fail, I'll never succeed," your behavior gradually aligns with that emotional expectation. But if identity shifts toward discipline, growth, stability, resilience, intentionality, behavior changes too. That's the hidden mechanism ancient traditions understood. Most people never interrupt their identity conditioning. They repeat same fears, same labels, same emotional narratives, year after year. Eventually, the mind stops questioning those beliefs. And once identity hardens, behavior follows automatically. That's why transformation requires identity change first. People who genuinely change internally often describe the same experience. Life begins responding differently, not because the universe magically changed overnight, because posture changed, confidence changed, communication changed, decisions changed, emotional reactions changed, and those changes affect real-world outcomes. That's why ancient teachings emphasize internal transformation so heavily. There's something fascinating about emotionally grounded individuals. People naturally notice them, not because they are louder, but because certainty creates presence. And certainty usually comes from identity stability. People who know who they are move differently. That affects leadership, opportunities, influence, trust, financial growth, all indirectly connected to identity. But there was something even deeper ancient people understood about names. The danger was never only what others called you. It was the identity you secretly accepted about yourself. Because once a person accepts limitation internally, their behavior begins building a smaller life automatically. There's a reason two people can walk into the same room and leave with completely different outcomes. Same economy, same opportunities, same environment. Yet one person attracts attention naturally, while the other disappears into the background. Ancient thinkers believe this difference often began long before the room itself. It began with identity, because people project internally what they repeatedly believe about themselves, and others respond to that energy constantly. A person's self-image quietly affects body language, confidence, tone of voice, eye contact, decision-making, emotional resilience. All of those things influence opportunities. That means wealth is not only connected to skill, it is also connected to perception, and perception begins internally first. That's why names mattered historically, because names became emotional anchors attached to identity over time. Many people unknowingly carry emotional identities that sabotage them daily, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack talent, but because internally they already expect limitation. That expectation changes behavior automatically. Someone who secretly believes, "People don't respect me," may unconsciously speak less confidently, avoid leadership, hesitate during opportunities, tolerate poor treatment. That creates smaller outcomes over time. Confidence changes social behavior immediately. People respond differently to certainty, not fake arrogance, grounded certainty. A confident person usually communicates more clearly, tolerates rejection better, takes more opportunities, remains calmer under pressure. That creates more visibility, more trust, more influence, which often affects financial growth too. Ancient people understood inner identity shapes outer interaction. Every person carries an internal story, a hidden narrative repeated constantly inside the mind. For some people, the story says, I am unlucky. Nothing works for me. Success belongs to other people. I'll always struggle. Over time, the brain begins protecting that identity. That's why some people unconsciously resist change, because new success conflicts with the old emotional story. This confuses many people. Why would someone destroy opportunities they claim to want? Because emotionally, success may feel unfamiliar, and human beings naturally return to identities that feel emotionally normal, even destructive ones. That's why identity transformation is so important. Without internal change, external success often collapses eventually. Ancient traditions respected certainty deeply, because certainty changes behavior. A person who feels emotionally certain hesitates less, communicates more powerfully, tolerates uncertainty better, remains calmer under pressure. That creates different outcomes, not magically, behaviorally. That's why identity reinforcement mattered historically. Repeated empowering identities strengthened emotional certainty over time. Many ancient names carried meanings intentionally: strength, wisdom, prosperity, peace, leadership, light, favor. Why? Because names were meant to reinforce emotional direction repeatedly. Every time the name was spoken, the identity attached to it strengthened psychologically. That's fascinating when you think about it, because modern people often underestimate how much repeated language shapes the mind. Today, many people are psychologically overloaded. Comparison destroys confidence. Social media distorts self-worth. Fear-based content creates insecurity. And eventually, people lose connection with stable identity. That creates emotional weakness. Emotionally weak people struggle with discipline, boundaries, consistency, confidence, opportunity tolerance. That affects finances indirectly but powerfully. Emotionally grounded people often appear calmer during difficulty. That's not accidental. Their identity is less dependent on external chaos, so they panic less, recover faster, remain intentional longer, avoid emotional overreaction. Those traits protect stability. Financially, too, because emotional reactions destroy more opportunities than lack of intelligence sometimes. Many people secretly fear visibility. They fear criticism, judgment, rejection, standing out. Why? Because their internal identity does not feel worthy of visibility yet. That creates self-protection behavior. People hide their gifts, avoid leadership, stay smaller than necessary. That limits opportunity naturally. But emotionally strong identity changes this. Confident people tolerate visibility differently. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to attract opportunities repeatedly? Ancient thinkers believe this often came from emotional positioning. Confident people speak up more, network more naturally, notice opportunities faster, recover from rejection quicker. That creates more chances for success. But fearful people withdraw emotionally. That reduces opportunities over time. Identity influences all of this quietly. Here's the deepest part. The most influential identity is not necessarily your birth name. It's the emotional name you silently repeat through self-talk. Because every day, you are emotionally introducing yourself to yourself internally, and the brain listens carefully. If the internal voice constantly says, I am weak, I always fail, I don't deserve more, behavior slowly aligns with limitation. But intentional identity reinforcement changes that pattern gradually. Names were not respected because of superstition alone. They were respected because identity affects destiny behaviorally. A person who emotionally identifies with discipline, growth, confidence, wisdom, intentionality will behave differently from someone identifying with fear and defeat. That changes decisions, relationships, opportunities, consistency, financial habits, and eventually life outcomes too. But the final secret ancient people understood about names was even deeper. A person's future often changes the moment they stop emotionally agreeing with limitation, because once identity changes internally, reality begins responding differently externally. There is a moment in every transformation that most people never notice. It does not happen publicly. It happens internally. The moment a person stops emotionally identifying with limitation, because once identity shifts, behavior begins shifting automatically. That was the deeper secret ancient people understood about names. A name was never just sound. It was emotional reinforcement, a repeated reminder of identity. And identity quietly shapes destiny through behavior over time. Most people don't realize they are living inside emotional identities they accepted years ago, maybe from childhood experiences, repeated criticism, failure, embarrassment, rejection, fear. Over time, those emotional experiences became internal labels. I'm not enough. I'll never succeed. I'm unlucky. I'm invisible. Eventually, the person stops questioning the label and begins building their entire life around it unconsciously. That affects confidence, relationships, risk tolerance, opportunities, financial behavior, everything. This confuses many people. Why do some individuals consume endless motivation, yet never truly change? Because information alone rarely changes identity. A person may consciously desire wealth, while subconsciously identifying with struggle, and subconscious identity usually wins. That's why ancient traditions focus heavily on repeated reinforcement, because repetition slowly reshapes emotional self-perception, and self-perception shapes behavior. Money responds to behavior, and behavior responds to identity. A confident person usually negotiates differently, communicates differently, tolerates pressure better, takes more calculated risks, recovers faster from setbacks. That creates different opportunities over time. Meanwhile, someone emotionally trapped in fear often hesitates constantly, avoids visibility, underestimates themselves, delays action, settles for less. That limits growth, not because they lack potential, because identity restricts behavior. Ancient thinkers understood something modern society ignores constantly. Repeated thoughts become emotional reality. That's why they protected language, rituals, names, affirmations, prayers, repeated teachings, not because they were naive, because they understood conditioning. The mind adapts to repeated emotional environments, and eventually, those environments shape personality. Here's the truth most people never hear. The most powerful name affecting your future is the identity your inner voice calls you every day. Because even if the world praises you externally, a weak internal identity still creates self-sabotaging behavior. But when the internal identity strengthens, everything changes. That changes posture, communication, resilience, emotional control, confidence, decision-making, and over time, those changes affect wealth too. Sometimes people appear completely different suddenly, more confident, more focused, more disciplined, more magnetic. But usually, the transformation started internally long before it became visible externally. Identity shifted first. And once identity changes, behavior follows naturally. That creates new outcomes. Ancient wisdom often emphasized agreement carefully, because whatever a person emotionally agrees with repeatedly strengthens internally. If someone repeatedly agrees with fear, hopelessness, weakness, limitation, their behavior slowly aligns with those beliefs. But when a person begins emotionally agreeing with discipline, growth, confidence, intentionality, resilience, their actions begin changing too. That's where transformation begins. Modern society constantly damages identity. Comparison culture creates insecurity. People begin measuring themselves against strangers constantly. That weakens confidence, emotional stability, self-respect, clarity, and emotionally weakened people often build smaller lives than they are capable of because self-worth affects ambition, standards, boundaries, opportunity tolerance. That influences wealth indirectly but powerfully. The people who truly transform financially often share one hidden trait. They stop identifying with their old limitations. At some point, they emotionally decide, this is no longer who I am. That internal separation changes behavior dramatically because people naturally act according to identity. Once identity upgrades, consistency becomes easier, discipline feels more natural, confidence strengthens, and over time, life changes excellently too. Every repeated internal statement shapes emotional conditioning. The mind is always listening. That's why ancient teachings respected repetition. Repeated identity creates emotional expectation, behavioral patterns, subconscious reactions, self-image. Eventually, those things shape destiny behaviorally. That's the real hidden connection between names and wealth, not superstition. Conditioning. Be careful what identity you repeat about yourself daily, because eventually, the mind begins protecting whatever identity it hears most often. If you constantly repeat, I'm broken, I'll never succeed, nothing changes for me, your behavior gradually follows limitation. But intentional identity changes everything slowly. So, tonight, pay attention to the way you speak about yourself internally, because your future is listening. Stop reinforcing weakness unconsciously. Begin reinforcing discipline, clarity, confidence, resilience, intentionality, emotional strength, not arrogantly, consciously, because once identity changes, behavior follows. And once behavior follows, life begins changing too. Ancient people believed a name was more than a word. It was a repeated agreement with identity. And the identity repeated long enough eventually becomes the life a person lives. Most people try to change their finances without changing the identity, controlling their behavior. But real transformation begins internally first. Subscribe to Ancient Wealth Secrets for more timeless wisdom on self-mastery, emotional strength, wealth psychology, intentional living, and the ancient principles that quietly shape destiny. And comment, my identity is changing. Because once a person stops agreeing with limitation, their future begins changing too.